we are to where they want to be is absolutely impossible in the period of time outlined. Robert Bloom from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation wrote in the Wall Street Journal saying, quote, "An all-renewable power grid is destined to collapse." America can't tolerate a collapsed power grid. Plus, it wouldn't solve the problem. Turning off America's economy won't lower global emissions. America is leading the way in reducing emissions. Reducing emissions. Since 2007, U.S. energy emissions have fallen by 14%, while global emissions continue to rise. In 2017, the United States produced just 13% of global emissions. China and India together, over 33%. So emissions are going to continue to climb until these countries take action. Emissions in the United States continues to decline. Shutting down our energy would also harm American workers. That's why major labor unions oppose the Green New Deal. The AFL-CIO labor union, which represents 12.5 million workers, says we will not accept proposals that could cause immediate harm to millions of our members and their families. I agree. Even former President Obama's Energy Secretary, Ernie Moniz, called the Green New Deal impractical. He said it would hurt American progress in reducing emissions. That progress came from innovation, not from massive government taxation and regulation. So Congress must continue to support technologies like nuclear power and carbon capture and utilization, things that we know make a difference. And we have done this in a bipartisan way in these areas. So I want to continue to work with Democrats to find real solutions. We have passed legislation in a bipartisan way for advanced nuclear power plants, for carbon capture, sequestration, using the carbon in productive ways, whether it's for medication, whether it's for construction products. Look, the Green New Deal is not the solution for America. It is a big green bomb that will blow a hole in our strong, healthy, and growing economy. That's exactly why Democrats aren't voting for it. That's exactly why Democrats are ducking and dodging and distancing themselves from this so-called Green New Deal, because it is a radical plan, and it's exactly why Democrats are running away from the Green New Deal. I think we're going to see it today, running away as fast as they can. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
the senator from New York.
Would my friend from Wyoming, who mentioned my name, yield for a question or three?
Madam President, I know the vote is scheduled at 4 o'clock.
I'd ask
I'm
unanimous
happy to
consent.
answer a question.
Okay.
And
now,
I understand that this.
My friend from Wyoming said, I said, bring on the vote on the Green New Deal. I did. Not because I think it's a smart thing to do, it's a stunt, but it would finally get us to talk about climate change, something the other side has not done. So I'd ask my colleague three questions. I was gratified to see Leader McConnell answered them for the first time at his press conference. Does the senator from Wyoming believe climate change is real? Does he believe it's caused by human activity? And does he believe Congress ought to do something about it? Those are my three questions. I'd hope I could get a direct answer since my name was invoked.
Well, thank you, Madam President. As a matter of fact, and I would say to my friend, the senator from New York, he asked me those three identical questions on this floor about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And my answer today is the same as it was then, and you're welcome to go back to the congressional record. And I recommended to the senator from New York an op-ed I wrote in the New York Times in December that said, yes, I do believe that climate change is real. And yes, I believe that humans contribute to it. And yes, I believe we have a responsibility to do something about it. And I highlighted the role of innovation, not taxation or regulation, in coming to those solutions. I highlighted legislation that is passed the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and even signed into law by the President, something called the Future Act that works on capturing carbon dioxide and using it productively. We talked about a bill called the Use It Act, which is now coming through the committee. We are working on it as bipartisan support, passed last session, didn't get all the way to a signature. We talked about the future of nuclear power, the advanced nuclear power plans that are being done, and we've paved the way for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to do things because nuclear power has zero emissions. These are bipartisan pieces of legislation passed overwhelming support by the Senate, the House, signed by the President, and these areas, both carbon capture and nuclear power works, are things that actually President Obama's Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, testified to the Senate Energy Committee are the two things that actually can work at scale. And anything else that the United States, I would tell you, does unilaterally will not contribute to a solution because emissions from the United States are only 13% of all the emissions in the world. So, Madam President, I would once again recommend to the senator from New York an op-ed that I had written about dealing with climate change through innovation, not regulation or taxation. And I'd hope in that way that I have answered the senator's three questions. I would say to the senator from New York that if he is actually serious about discussing climate change on the floor of the United States Senate and looking for solutions, then what he ought to do today is instruct his members that I believe he may have instructed to vote present, to vote to get on the bill, to get on this, to discuss it, to debate it. But it doesn't sound like even the co-sponsors are willing to stand up and vote for something that they have co-sponsored. A dozen of them had done it. 3 of them were leading a rally, Madam President, outside the steps of the Capitol within the last couple of hours, with one senator chanting about what about the Green New Deal and having a vote on it, and when do we want it, and the crowd is chanting now. It'll be instructive to see if that senator, and one of these was a candidate for president, see how they vote when their name is called, as the roll is called here, on today's vote on the Green New Deal.
The Democratic leader.
Thank you. First, I thank my colleague from Wyoming. Now he knows why I've said bring it on. We are finally getting even people like the senator from Wyoming to admit that climate change is real, it's caused by human activity, and we should do something about it. And if we could have an open debate on climate change, that would be great. That's not what's happening today. The senator from Wyoming talks about the contradictions of the senator outside. How about the contradictions of the Republican Party and the senators here putting a bill on the floor that they're going to vote no on? Let's put the bill that the senator from Wyoming asked for, and let there be an open amendment process, and let's see where people fall. All we are asking for is not a sham vote where every people who put the bill on the floor are voting no because they don't want to have a debate, but rather a real discussion and real debate and real amendments. And so I would say this, Madam President. Earlier today, even better than having the senator from Wyoming finally admit climate change is real and caused by human activity, the Republican leader did when asked by the press at his gathering. The whole plan of the Republican leader here is backfiring. We want a discussion on climate. We haven't had one major bill on the real issues of climate come to the floor, led by the leader, where we can have open debate. Not one. So now we're finally beginning to debate it. That is great. We're not going to stand for sham bills that the other side is all voting no on. They know what a trick and joke and sham that is. So does all the American people. But we are finally talking about the issue, and that is great. Because climate change is not a joke, it's not a hoax, it's a crisis. And that's why we're doing these things. So right now, Madam President, here's something else we could do. Let's see where our Republican colleagues are if they want to have a real debate. I am calling for the creation of a Senate Select Committee on Climate Change. It's a crisis. Ask the farmers in Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas if they think it's a crisis. Ask the people who've been subject to so many changes in the weather because the globe is heating up. They believe it's a crisis. The very least we can do is do what the House did and set up a select committee on climate change, bipartisan. The committee could be partners with the House committee, and we might actually get something done, not sham votes that everyone knows are a joke, a political joke. And so I am hopeful that we can do that. The reason for the select committee is clear. If there ever were an issue that demanded focus from this chamber, this is it. Climate change is an existential threat to our committee, to our country, and our planet. The last 4 years have been the warmest on record. Sea levels are rising. Marine life, fishing communities are being destroyed. Record flooding is inundating parts of the country, most recently the Midwest. And more powerful hurricanes have buffeted our coasts. Over the next decade, climate change will continue to negatively impact every part of American life: our health, our economy, our national security, even our geography. And the threats will only grow. So we can't run into our ideological corners anymore. I am gratified to hear a growing number of Republicans admit it's real, admit it's caused by human activity, and that we should do something about it. That's great news, but let's do something real. Let's do something real. The senator mentioned a few bills. I'd be happy to look at them. I hope he'll look at ours, and I hope he'll ask this leader, his leader, the Republican leader, to allow an open debate on the floor with amendments. We'd welcome that. We'd welcome it. Some in the oil and gas industry won't like it, that's for sure. Some in the coal industry won't like it, that's for sure. But most Americans will. So let's do it. The time for partisanship on this issue is long over. The time for one party to block any change and not offer anything that they believe in is over. We need to act quickly and boldly to confront this challenge before it's too late. So it's time we stop the nonsense. As I said, we welcome this debate because we're talking about climate change for the first time, and the hypocrisy of putting a bill on the floor and then voting against it is becoming so clear to the American people. But as a byproduct, we're getting a debate. We're getting some of our colleagues for the first time to admit that climate change is real and caused by human activity, and we ought to do something about it. We welcome it. This committee will help bring the kind of bipartisan discussion that my good friend from Wyoming has asked for. And so let's do it. So, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Rules Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-Res 97, a resolution establishing the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. The resolution be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
The senator from Wyoming.
reserving the right to object, and I would like to point out to my friend and colleague that the statement I had made earlier about my belief goes back a long time, that the climate is changing, to the point that one of his colleagues, Jeff Bingaman of New Mexico, chaired the Energy Committee when he and I co-sponsored legislation dealing with carbon and carbon capture and putting together an X-Prize type program. So this is something I've long spoken about and understand. I also hear the senator from New York essentially trying to strip the EPW committee of the jurisdiction we have over climate change. That's the wrong approach when we have made real progress working together, not just on bills, but on bills signed into law that are making a difference today. Madam President, this resolution is that the minority leader has just introduced is an attempt by the Democrats to once again duck and dodge and distance themselves from the Green New Deal vote this afternoon. The Democrats seem to think that adding a layer of bureaucracy is an answer to every problem. That's the same instinct that gave us the Green New Deal. The climate is changing. Humans play a role in the changing climate. There is no question in my mind about that. I'm going to continue to work closely with the ranking member of the committee, Member Carper from Delaware, to pass meaningful legislation to promote nuclear power, carbon capture technologies, and to reduce emissions. So Democrats can't hide from the fact that every Democrat senator running for president has co-sponsored the Green New Deal. Here we are today, Madam President, and I will just tell you, we've been passing bipartisan legislation. The Energy and Natural Resources Committee recently held a hearing on climate change. We do not need another committee. We don't need the Green New Deal. We need real solutions. And for this reason, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Would the senator yield for a question?
All time has expired.
I'd ask unanimous consent we be given 2 minutes so the senator from Rhode Island could ask a question of the senator from Wyoming.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I appreciate the comments of my distinguished chairman on the Environment and Public Works Committee, and I'm interested in his reliance on carbon capture technology, and I'm wondering what part of the carbon emissions problem he thinks that carbon capture will solve, because leaders of the carbon capture technology sector have said that it is their vision to capture 1% of carbon emissions. So what I conclude from that is that carbon capture technology is important, but to rely on it at the expense of the sort of action that we really need is profoundly misguided.
Well, Madam President, I know the time has expired. I would say we've had a hearing on this within the last couple of weeks. We've had an expert come who is in this specific area of carbon capture to show how much more effective the technology has become. This is something I started working on 10 years ago. It is something that researchers around the world are committed to because we're finding a value in that carbon to create products that can be used either medically or for construction. The University of Wyoming has an integrated test center right next to a coal-fired power plant. And the technology is there to take the carbon dioxide right from the stack and use it. Some for enhanced oil recovery, some for production, and they're continuing to work. And I believe in the science of all of this. Certainly there are the climate alarmists who are out there, Madam President. And it does seem that what they want to do is act immediately, drastically, and unilaterally in ways that will not solve the problem. It will hurt our country. It will hurt our economy. It will move the lifeblood of the United States economy to foreign countries. And I will do everything I can to make sure that that doesn't happen. Thank you, Madam President. I know the time has expired, and I go back to regular order and the call for the vote. Thank you.
I'm interested in the other 99%.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 27, S.J. Res. 8, a joint resolution recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 8, a joint resolution recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, No senator voted in the affirmative. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Cornyn, Enzi, Graham, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Isaacson, Langford, Roberts, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Sullivan, and Young. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Ms. McSally, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Lee, no. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Purdue, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Miss Cinema. Miss Cinema, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change their vote? Seeing none, on this vote, the yeas are 0, the nays are 57, and 43 senators responded present. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 15 to H.R. 268, making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019, and for other purposes.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 268, an act making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019, and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett.